All right. Thank you. So let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Richard Lofton, and I am an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. And I am so honored, actually, to be able to give a talk today. This week, I had the opportunity to reflect and think about the history of African American professors. And it made me realize it was not very long ago that African Americans could be professors, particularly in historically white institutions. And it made me humble myself, but also made me think about the pain and suffering and the sacrifice that my ancestors, as well as this generation, is doing in order to allow people of color in the university to speak. And so I'm extremely grateful. And I'm also grateful for this opportunity here today. So thank you very much. Thank you. And Gwen, I will tell you, I'm going to make a point because you text me to say this. Well, not to say this, but you text me to let me know, please do not frown. So I'm going to smile as much as possible, okay? Because I know that you say I always frown when I give talks because the issue sometimes is so serious. So I'm going to smile a little bit today. So anyway, so let's get into it. Let's get to work. I had the opportunity. I've been working with this concept of the Black Habitus, and I've really been having some intellectual fun with it. The title of my presentation is Understanding Black Urbanism Through the Complexities of the Black Habitus. Um, so by me having the opportunity to really reflect and think about African Americans in the institution, I think it's only appropriate for me to start off with Du Bois, right? The brilliant mind of Du Bois. I believe that Du Bois was the first sociologist, right? And he wrote the book, The Soul of Black Folks. But getting back to what I was saying earlier, he graduated from Harvard, well, but was not able actually to be a professor at University of Pennsylvania. But that did not stop him from doing the work that he wanted to do. The Souls of Black Folks, he brought up something that to me still puzzled me, and I'm still grappling with some of these ideas right now. He says in the book, the Negro is a sort of seven son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a particular sensation that a sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Today, I really want to focus in on. I know many people talk about this double consciousness. We'll get to that. But for me, I want to talk about this veil and how I'm applying this veil to my research. If you look today in this current world, you can see that we are actually still, African Americans are still encountering the veil, right? When you think about Breonna Taylor, right, being killed in her own home when she was sleeping. When you think about George Floyd, when you think about Aubrey and him just running, right, and you also think about Christian Cooper, so funny. Encounter, trying to enjoy his passion, trying to do what he wants to do. And this woman named Amy, tried to block him from enjoying what he wants to do by threatening him and causing the cops on him. So we're still encountering this veil. And I today want to kind of connect this veil to how current researchers are really talking about race and racism in the United States. Let's see. All right. Um, the veil can be related. I'm going to try to approach the veil can be related to the anti-blackness that African Americans are encountering in the United States. I want us to really start thinking about anti-Blackness, right? Anti-Blackness is really trying to describe the inability to recognize Black humanity. So, what it tries to do is move the argument beyond the ideas of just systemic or social inequalities or institutional racism, but look at it from a way of looking at this ever present ideas, thoughts, behavior inside of institutions, outside of institutions. It continue to exist for African Americans. This inability to recognize the humanism of African Americans. Often in our current world, and as you know, we know that African Americans are often viewed, as the boy said, as the problem, right? So in our current world, they're often think of as criminals and thugs and welfare queens. Black families are full of pathologies, right? There's something wrong with Black families. There's something wrong with Black women. There's something wrong with Black men, right? But also, we often get this whole they're enemies to society. So just really looking at this. But I think these ideas, this ideal of criminals, this way of associating African Americans with being a thug is deeply rooted within the United States, right? When you think about slavery and what people had to do to allow slavery to exist, allow for this huge dehumanization through social policies, through the public discourse. And I think we're still dealing with remnants of that today. And we can see that through the criminalization of so many African Americans today in prisons today. So, in order for this to come about, a social death had to occur, right? So, when you think about the work of Orlando Taylor, when you think about slavery, he said, in order for it to occur, there is a social death that had to occur. So, not acknowledging the humanity of African Americans, right? Associating them with less than when it comes to slavery. I think today we're still dealing with some of those issues because there's still traces of this currently in our country, but also we're seeing the constant violence that is happening, and if you go back to my earlier slide that shows that constant violence as well as the hyper surveillance that many African Americans are encountering. But not only are they encountering this violence and this hyper surveillance, they also are encountering, throughout the years, isolation, segregation, exploitation, exclusion from policies and laws, right? But also, this anti-Blackness also prevents the exchange of resources and opportunities in many African American homes, schools, and communities. All right, so how am I connecting this to the habitus, right? So I believe that Bourdieu, one of the ones who really brought this to the United States, um, we could think about habitus in a way of looking at external constraints. I believe that could be for African Americans can be related to anti-Blackness and also the cognitive actions. So when Bourdieu was talking about these structured structures that many people are reading about. For me, I internalize that, or I think of it in a way of external constraints that relate to anti-Blackness that African Americans encounter. Also, the cognitive actions that come about with this as well. So what we're seeing is that not only are we dealing with constraints and oppression because of anti-Blackness, this veil of anti-Blackness, but also we're looking at the resiliency and the agency of African Americans as well, producing their own knowledge, their own dialects, their own styles, their own appreciations. So moving beyond the idea of just being bonded, right? Or just being forced to do something, but developing and understanding their own social world, but also bringing meaning in the way that they want to bring meaning to their lives, as well as to their families. Um, Also, Du Bois, also Bourdieu, when he was talking about the habitus, was really talking about class, right? But I think in order to talk about the black habitus, we must move away from just looking at class, but look at the intersectionality, right? Kimberly Crenshaw has brought that to our attention of race, class, gender, and sexuality. But not only that, when we think about the anti-blackness veil, I think it's so important for us to also think about the different routes that African Americans have had to encounter because of anti-blackness, right? Not only must we look at the oppressive routes and the confined spatial locations. But I think it's so important for us to look at how African Americans are making place, moving beyond boundaries and making meaning out of their world. And so I think black placemaking fit within the black habitus, right? Meaningful places that foster endurance, belonging, love, joy, resistance amid anti-blackness. So we think about churches, right? We think about sororities and fraternities and community centers and local sports clubs and little leagues and baseball leagues and beauty shops and barber shops. We see that African Americans are making place. So one of the things that I find in the literature, either, we're all oppressed, right? Or we're all ignored, right? And so it's so important for me to acknowledge this place making that African Americans have made on their own, right? In the midst of anti black policies and things that came their way. All right, I'm going the wrong way, seems like. Next slide. Next slide. All right. So we see this anti-blackness in housing policies, right? So, and one of the ways that it was done is really looking at viewing African Americans as dirty or spreading a disease, or bringing down the property of whites, right? So the veil continues in housing policies. And when you look at this, you can see that in the early 1900s, right, there was the racial covenants. But we also know during that time there were so many racial riots throughout the United States. But not only that, we see that in the 1930s to the 1970s, federal laws allow for these anti-black policies to exist and prevent African Americans from buying homes and getting loans from the federal government. We also see this blockbusting that occurred, right? And then from 1950 to the 1980s, we also can research and find out this aggressive urban renewal that displaced many African Americans throughout the United States in urban spaces. But not only that, the white flight that occurred, right? But what we also know from our research, Patillo's work for sure, of how some African American moved to adjacent communities, middle class African Americans moved to adjacent communities, but yet they still had to deal with the lack of resources and services and opportunities that their fellow white middle class citizens were able to enjoy. And we know, regardless of middle class or people who are living in concentrated poverty, the communities are often have less disinvestment and also the devaluation of their homes as well. So this is some of the things through policy and practices we're dealing with when we think about urban spaces. And I'm encourage us to think about it through an anti-blackness lens within the black habitus. All right. So what has this produced, right? Or how this has influenced many things that are happening in African American communities. Well, when you think about urban African American communities throughout the United States, we see that there's an increase of crime. We also see there's an increase of violence, the police brutality, right? Hyper incarceration, right? Limited access to public services and services that do not work for African Americans, right? We see poor housing in many of these places, abundance of liquor store, higher banking expenses. All of these have been documented, right? Higher rates of unemployment, limited employment and opportunities, and one third adults are high school dropout in many of these areas. So we're still dealing with the effects of anti-blackness today, and our African Americans are still encountering these issues. So one of the things that I want to do, and one of the point I really want to make, is that we often talk about these areas of concentrated poverty, right? But I think if you think about my previous slide, I think it's more accurate to say there's a concentrated debt, right? When you think about African Americans in urban spaces, particularly African Americans who are in concentrated poverty, we see that um, almost 3 out of 4 African American families living in the most segregated, poorest neighborhoods are the same families that lived in the concentrated poverty of the civil rights movement. Right? But nearly 40% of people who are living in concentrated poverty are African American. And if you go back to that earlier slide where I brought out the different policies, but also the social actors who prevented African Americans from benefiting from those policies and excluded African Americans, we can say that it's probably better to say, or getting closer at understanding a concentrated debt versus a concentrated poverty for African Americans. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who talked about this check of insufficient funds, right? And today, if we look at urban areas, particularly African American homes, schools, and communities in urban and concentrated poverty, we can, I think, argue that the debt is still there, and there's still a check of insufficient funds in many African American homes, schools, and communities. So, how are youth making sense of the concentrated debt within the Black habitus? I want to stop right here, and I laid out many thoughts, right, just now. And I want to kind of go over some of the things I just talked about, to see if I could get everyone to think and to help people understand where I'm coming from with these ideas that I'm talking about. So youth, right? Making sense of this concentrated debt. Often policy is looking at concentrated poverty and how African Americans are making sense of concentrated poverty. But for me in my research, I think we have to start looking at the concentrated debt because of the social policies and also the social actors and also the work that people have done to prevent African Americans from the exchange of resources and opportunities, right? But then not only that, also this Black habitus, right? So these external forces as well as these internal forces as well, right? So how are they making sense of this concentrated debt within the Black habitus? What I did a case study to really understand what's going on, how African American youth are making sense of the concentrated debt, right? And so I live in Baltimore, and I had the opportunity to actually go into the fields and interview African American youth after the Freddie Gray situation. And to give a little social context, to Baltimore. Baltimore is a tale of two cities. Baltimore is 62% African American, 28% white, and 6% Latinx. Um, Many scholars refer to it where black people live as the black butterfly and the L shape. This is right here is the L shape that people are referring to right here. This is the L shape. And then the blue part is the butterfly, the black butterfly. Um, and the majority of African Americans live in these areas, right? From 2011 to 2016, neighborhoods that were less than 50% African American received four times less more investment than communities that were more than 85% African Americans, right? And some sociologists contend that Baltimore is the worst place to gain upward mobility, particularly for African American males. So I interviewed 38 African American youth about their experiences of growing up in Baltimore. The interviews ranged from 40 minutes to 2 hours. The interviews were done right after the Freddie Gray homicide of Freddie Gray. In addition to interviewing African American youth, I interviewed teachers, principals, school administrators, city council members, and also school district administrators. I decided to do the interviews in the community. I went into the community, and so these are some black spaces within Baltimore that I actually went into and to do this research. Um, and for the sake of time, I just want to focus on one finding that I continue to find in the literature. And actually, this finding is related to education. I'm a sociologist of education, and I spend the majority of my time researching how African Americans are making sense of their educational experiences. And so I want to spend the rest of this time talking about this veil that we saw, or I was able to see when I heard the voices and experiences of African American students. And there's three things that I want to talk about that came up here. And one is we take it for granted that we are viewing and we're thinking of African American youth as students. But I think we need to review that and rethink that because in many of these situations, the youth reported people thinking of them and calling them different names, right? And student was not one of them, right? So I want us to really just to go back to our basic understanding, as we try to bring resources and opportunity to African American students. But think about how do we represent the social life of African American students within policy, but also how do we view and treat African American students and their homes, their schools, and also their communities. So, according to Maryland Constitution, right, um, they students are supposed to receive a thorough and efficient system of free public school, right? According to the Constitution, right? But as Martin Luther King said about the insufficient funds, we see that many students in urban areas, particularly students in Baltimore, they're still receiving insufficient funds, right? And students constantly talked about the classrooms were either too hot or too cold, or there were issues with the classroom. But Jessica makes this point. She says the classrooms were either too cold or too hot, right? And then we have Brian saying even more to this. He says, we didn't have computer labs. We didn't have enough books, desks, chairs, classrooms to be able to teach us. Those were the resources that were basically missing, right? And so we have constitutional rights, but yet the social life of African American students, we still are not providing them with the basics, right? With a thorough and efficient system of free education, right? And the students constantly reported this, that they were not receiving the resources that they are supposed to receive. So I'm gonna try to take this down. Yeah, okay. But what was interesting is that the reason that students felt that they were not receiving these resources is because they felt they were not viewed as students, that they were viewed as part of a military, or they were viewed as thugs, or they were viewed as criminals or looters, or, just different negative connotations associated with blackness. And for them, this prevented them from receiving the resources and also the school environments that they needed. We have Stacy right here, and she talked about treat it like you are in the military. Stacy says the school system that is plagued with most of the time teachers who are unequipped to handle the students, teachers who are under a lot of stress, teachers who come from a different background, so they view students as having behavioral issues, emotional issues, and teachers who don't respect students. They, most of the time, when you sit in a classroom in Baltimore City, I know because I've gone from K to 12. Your day is filled with being treated like you're a part of a military society and not a student. You're constantly yelled at, constantly punished, constantly hearing doors slamming through the day, books being thrown, teachers at their wits' end. It's not a positive environment to learn, right? So we have Stacy talking about her experience of going through school through the K through 12, and not necessarily being viewed as a student, but not even but not not it wasn't only not having the teachers and the equipment necessary for upward ability and to develop the skills in order to for career and adult readiness and success, but it was how she was treated in these schools, and she says like she was in the military, right? And what I find very interesting, she breaks it down, right? She doesn't even stop there. Constantly punished, right? So going back to this anti-blackness, right? That's deeply rooted within institutions, policies, and social interactions, right? This punishment that happens to African Americans. She's talking about it. But not only that, she's talking about it, but hearing the door slamming through the days and books being thrown, and then one of the things that I constantly uncover when we talk about people in urban areas is the issues are so deep that it not only impact the people who live in these communities, but the teachers who sometimes live and sometimes do not live in these communities are also dealing with many of these burdens as well. We can think about this in the health field. We can think about this with just the emotional care we need to give, but these additional burdens that come about because of these anti-Black policies that constantly exist in our current day society. We also have students who who talked about being called everything but a student, right? So we were labeled thugs. We were thugs to them, not students. So we have in African Americans talk about their experiences and thinking about how they were labeled and thinking about, if we think about the habitus, right? How they are making sense of it. Just thinking about not going to school every day, but not being perceived and treated as a student, right? And then we also had Kim, who brought up they use standardized testing as a critique, and people get so caught up in standardized testing that they miss teaching the students. They care more about the test than they do about the students, right? So we have how students are making sense of this, right? And educators from years we've been knowing that it's not about the standardized test in order to educate students, but yet policy continue to make it a major issue, and that we forget about how to nurture love and care for students. So that social depth and policy we must continue to think about. Another point that I want to raise is it's not just what happens in schools. I think it is ever present. And when I was out in the field, I had the opportunity to really talk to youth. And Joyce, I met her several times, and she was on the high school debate team, and she was so excited. She was her debate team was selected to go to Yale to present to debate, and so she was excited about this. They found money from somewhere. They all were together, laughing and enjoying and having a good time because they were at Yale. And the day before they were supposed to debate, they wanted to just go to the pool at Yale and just have a swim to enjoy and to prepare, get their minds off of the next day where they're going to have this debate with many high school students throughout the United States. And she tells me about this story about walking to the pool. And she said, we were walking to the pool. It was like at the end of the block. And that's where the pool and everything was. We were walking, 5 of us. Like I said, we were going to the pool. We had towels, we had the drawstring bags, and we were just laughing, having a good time, just walking to the pool. Police stopped and had their guns and stuff like that drawn. Here I am, a 15-year-old, 16-year-old young lady looking down the barrel of a gun. I've never experienced that a day in my life. And I will always remember it because I could have been that Trayvon Martin at that time. I could have been the Freddie Gray at that time, the Tamar Rice at that time. And what was I armed with? My Yale badge, a towel, armed in a bathing suit. I didn't understand what that transpired to be, but they were saying you all fit the description of people stealing computers, right? And so I think what we want to think about is how anti-blackness moves from many institutions, right? And also in different places. As one youth reported to me, it is something that is in the air, right? So that veil is something that's in the air, right? And if you go back to Joyce, what she's saying with this is that she was just trying to enjoy the day, right? And police stopped her. But this idea that I constantly see throughout the interviews of always looked upon as a problem, as Du Bois said, but also in this time, a criminal, a thug. There's something wrong. You're going to steal, or you have stole, or you're going to do something wrong. This is what's stopping people from viewing African American students as students, right? And so that's something that I constantly found in the literature when I was looking at, when I was hearing these voices and seeing how they made sense within their habitus. But I think it's also important to note with this transcript, this quote, is that the issues that African Americans experience it's not only impacting what happens on TV, not only impact the person who is experiencing it, but African Americans are having this vicarious experience, right? And so she says, I experienced that in a day, and I always remember it because I could have been Trayvon Martin. So she's going through all the experiences that she have seen on TV and relating it to her own experience, right? And I think there's so much work to be done when we think about how people are living, particularly African Americans, are living through these vicarious experiences that we constantly are witnessing, in the news or in social media, or even as we walk up and down the streets every day, and the trauma that it is causing, and how African Americans, particularly these youth right here, are internalizing it. So, I think with my presentation, or what I want to say in what my presentation is, we live in a country that has historically dehumanized African Americans, and we're still facing anti Black policies, practices, and laws. Social actors constantly, implicitly, or maybe not explicitly, actually are impacting or are producing anti-Blackness in homes, in African American homes, schools, and communities. So there's a check, right? The check of insufficient funds continues to accumulate in many African American homes, schools, and communities. And that's something I want us to really think about, right? And I want us in some ways to think of it in the way of the concentrated debt versus the concentrated poverty. This debt that Martin Luther King talked about, to humanize African Americans and give them the same resources and opportunities and equality and justice in the United States. Youth perceived that they were viewed and talked about an anti-Blackness in ways which prevented them from being looked upon as just students, right? So how do we get to the place where we're viewing students as students when it comes to African American students? Not thugs, not criminals, you know. Um, this perception and collective consciousness, they believe, stopped equity and justice in funding, and allowed them to be treated as criminals, and like they were in the military, or allowed policies to be developed that focus on testing and accountability rather than focus on their educational and developmental needs. Like I said earlier, for one youth, this anti-Blackness was not only in institutions or in systems, but it was in the air. And that's something that I think, we want to really think about. But also this, the check of insufficient funds, Martin Luther King also talked about seeing the promised land, right? He said, I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people can get to the promised land. I believe that we can get to the promised land, right? But I think there's some questions that we must clearly ask ourselves in order to get there. How do we bring the social life experiences, joys, happiness, right, cultural knowledge of African Americans to policies and also to practices? How do we move away from concentrated poverty, right? Which also sometimes have negative connotations because of so much work has been done to talk about the black family, right? Or the Oscar Lewis work when he talks about poverty and how people who are in poverty mainly sometimes their own fault. Right. So we want to move away from that when we're talking about African Americans. And I think the best way to think about it, unless we are able to come up with something else, is to examine the concentrated debt. And also, how do we ensure that we fulfill the promise of education to African American students in urban areas? So, all throughout the United States, we have policies, state policies, as well as federal policies that talk about adequate education or thorough and sufficient education. How are we able to sustain that and make sure our students are able to have schools where they're not cold, or schools where they do not have books and supplies and things that they need, but also are treated like students, not people who are in the military or in prison. So once again, as I say, I believe that we can get there, but it's time to start asking ourselves some very serious questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Yes, so does anyone have any questions? We can either use the raised hand function, or if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and introduce yourself and go ahead and ask a question, or you could put in the chat. So you have a couple options.
Is it okay to start?
Please.
Hi, Richard, thank you so much for a really, really interesting and compelling talk. I'm Kelly Moore, and I'm associate professor in the sociology department. I'm not an urban sociologist, but I study, one of my interests in coming to the talk is about embodiment and racialization. And so I was very interested in what you had to say, and really loved your introduction of the idea that rather than thinking of poverty, thinking of debt. Really great. I'm interested to hear a little bit more about this idea of habitus. And I really am excited about that because as you told these stories, one of the things that kept coming through over and over again was, and I'm taking this straight from like Bourdieu's idea, but also it's very much reflected in Du Bois's work and many other people's work. And that is the embodied felt feeling that you're conveying here. I thought that the story you told about going to the pool was especially evocative. And that in terms of what people are experiencing in education, it's as if the habitus, the habit, the world they live in, but literally embody, is one in which non-belonging, criminality, defensiveness is incorporated into the embodied self. So when I think about, and I often think about this with my students, about what would it mean for them to be in what I call a learner's position? Like, what do they need in order to be able to learn and take in? And one of the things they need is not to be afraid. Yeah. And they need to feel like it's okay to talk and make mistakes and other things. So I wonder if you could say more about this idea of what gets built in at the level of embodiment and affect. That is related to what happens in education. So it's long-winded, but I really was enthusiastic, wanted to share that and ask a question. So thank you.
No, thank you for actually asking me the question, and thank you for listening to me. I appreciate that. So when we think about habitus, right, people can date back to, say, Aristotle, and, Bourdieu was really influential, which really helped us understand social reproduction, right? And I think what I take from habitus is really trying to understand the social factors as well as the structure, as well as the, so these two structures, right? So there's one, these external structures, and then these internal, this mental structures, right? And then you bringing up about this embodiment that occurs because of that. And you're right, you're completely right when you talk about how the student, she talked about her experience, right? But also not only her experience, but when she's talking about her experience, she's talking about other African American experiences as well. And then I think that what we want to do is provide the spaces to ensure that African Americans feel like they belong, right? Spaces where African Americans are not being, always attacked and dealing with terror and dealing with these issues. But you're right, we embody it all the time. Right. There's certain things that I know I do. I tell the story all the time with my mom. She grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and she grew up in a very segregated. She saw many of the things that were happening, and she witnessed it, right? Just terror that she witnessed, and she married a man, and she lived in L.A. And my dad had a really nice job as a computer engineer, and he will actually take us every week to different restaurants throughout California, right? And he will learn about these places through the people that are on his job. And when my mom would enter these spaces, the first 5 minutes, you could tell she was extremely nervous, right? She was dealing with these issues, and she was like, "Why did why did I come here?" And so there was a reaction to that, right? And I see how we are embodying this history, right? But not only that, even today, if you notice, when I started, I get nervous talking in front of white people because of the attacks that white professors have done to me, or the institutional betrayal that I constantly feel. So I think the question we must ask ourselves is, how are we producing these spaces so Black voice, Black social life, and Black creativity can be developed and nurtured? Because yes, we do embody these experiences, and that's something that I think right now we need to really work on. But we first need to work on producing the spaces that dismantle the anti-Blackness that African Americans often feel every single moment. And I do believe that we have to move the idea away from institutions. I like when one of the youth said, "It is something that is in the air," and I think that that's something that we need to think about.
So I just want to say thank you for that, and also just really quickly that because you brought up the idea of debt, I'm so interested in the way the experience of feeling that owes something, one owes others something, even though their experience is obviously of being systematically harmed. But this feeling of debt, of that kind of thing also seems to play in. I'll stop now, and thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to pick up on that, Richard and Kelly, if I could, and talk about how important it is that the money for education follow the student, so that according to the number of students you have, that's how much money your school has. I'm a professor of theology, retired now, but I was raised in Canada, and I taught school in Canada before I went to Peru for 4 years and then came back and did graduate work. But before that, I taught elementary school for 9 years, grades everything but grade 1 and grade 8. When I came here to Chicago, there was a news program, just tell a little story. I was watching the news, and it was about a broken window in a school on the south side. And nobody had come to fix the window. So the local news was there, and the principal was there showing the window. I can't tell you how appalled I felt. I can't tell you what a shock it was for me to be watching that coverage, because the school looked like it was built in 1760. It wasn't that old, but I mean, it was an old school, old windows. And more than that, when I looked through the window, I could see that their desks were too small for the children. The room was bare. There was nothing. There wasn't like a little library and over here a little something. And there was a kid who was clearly, redoing his grade. There was no seat for him. He had his haunches up on the basin that's at the back of the class, and the kids were in their winter coats. The poverty of that school, and that wasn't what the principal was just talking. We've got to get these windows. It's winter time, but and I don't want to say, oh, Canada is perfect, but I want to say that in Canada, education is a big deal, and the money follows the student. So all schools have to have the same quality. Now, I taught in St. John's School for 2 years, and it was all kids from the Azores. The families had just come in from those islands. The parents had a grade 2 education, and the kids came to the school. And our school was a beautiful school, just as nice as the one over there, because that's the law. And I think one of the scandals in Chicago, and I don't know if it's all over Illinois, but one of the scandals in Chicago is the way the education money is parceled out. Those poor kids who were talking about inferior teachers, the conduct of teachers, throwing things at children and so on. These teachers would lose their job. So I think that how can you instill a sense of personal importance to a student if they have to go every day to a situation where they're treated like that? I remain appalled. And the money, it requires money going to those schools and to those families, and for their children to have a proper education with everything that any other school has. Now, mind you, there's private schools and they've got all the bells and whistles. But I'm just talking about a regular good school, and I'm appalled about it, and I feel so sorry when you read the piece from the students about the way they were treated, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, this is going on, right? This is what student youth are experiencing every single day. And I think we really need to rethink that and change that, right? We have allowed policies to focus on standards and accountability without acknowledging the infrastructure, not acknowledging the quality of teaching, not acknowledging what families, parents, what they want. And when I first read these interviews, I didn't pick up on the idea of them, the youth, not thinking that they were students, right? I read everything else, but then I start looking at it more and more, and I constantly start seeing them talk about how they were viewed, right? How they were talked about. During the same time that I was interviewing, it was this big debate because even President Obama during this time called the African American youth in Baltimore thugs, right? He didn't understand that many of these youth were actually trying to get to their transportation hub in this area, and police were surrounding them, right? And so you have something that's in the air once again in policy, and that we must really take the time to unpack, right? We must really bring that social life to African Americans. Let us humanize African Americans, right? But not only humanize, let us really deal with that concentrated debt that is accumulating and has been accumulating since African Americans have set foot in the United States.
And I see that Gwendolyn, you have your hand up.
Good morning, everyone. I'm
Smelly.
I'm an associate professor at North Park University, but also an alum of Loyola from the sociology PhD program as well. So I thank you, Dr. Lofton and Richard, for your presentation. As you were talking, one of the things that came into my mind, especially when you were showing some of the quotes from the students, is Victor Rios's book Punished,
Yeah.
and how the youth, the African American and the Latinx youth in Oakland, are stalked by the state, right, and by various agents of the state, and how the teachers, who are also agents of the state, that they're in public schools, but people aren't coming after these youth to try to resolve the debt, this concentrated debt that
Mhm.
you're talking about, but actually adding to it.
Yes.
What advice do you have, like, for people who work with community-based organizations on how they can work with youth who are every day wrestling with this stalking and this hunting that is happening, but also these organizations are aware that students are entering buildings where the stalking and the punishment is still occurring, whether it's the slam doors, treating them like they're in the military, but also treating them through a lens of criminality. So what can community-based organizations do to reduce those stressors, especially if those same communities don't have psychological services, but they are doing some work as CBOs? Do you have any advice?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for asking me a hard question. That's your job. No, I'm joking. But one of the things I get opportunity to actually stress is the work of community activists and community leaders who are bringing up some of these very important issues and trying to get policy to really empower youth and their families. And in Baltimore, I had the opportunity through this study actually to develop meaningful relationships with community activists and community leaders. And we actually have put on symposiums, and we right now, Gwen, you also know this, is that we have the Nobody Ask Me campaign, where I am actually interviewing 100 households, so 100 families in Baltimore. And one of the things we want to do is to bring that social life, to policy and really connect with community members as well as with families to understand their voices and their experiences and making sure that we are working together. So I think that one of the things that we want to do is I think this is the best time to start sharing our resources and our opportunities with community leaders. And often we do not do that, right? And so institutions, universities, we have the opportunity to do that. But we often stay within our ivory tower and we do not connect in meaningful ways with community activists as well as community leaders, to be honest, with the community. And then also the institution makes it sometimes hard for us to do that, right? So if you do this, you cannot get tenure. If you do this, you're going to have all these drawbacks and all these things that that's going to come your way. But like I said in the beginning, it was through my ancestors the reason why I'm here today. So we must continue that work as well. And I think one of the things that we want to do is connect with community and let community connect with us, right? I have a research team where there's one community activist who we're constantly talking, and he is helping me more than I am helping him. And what I mean by that is the intellectual knowledge, the information, the understanding what is going on, right? It's really helping me understand the social world that we are actually living, but also it's helping me understand of really addressing some of the issues that youth are encountering. And so I think our job is really, in some ways, to connect and build relationship with community members, to figure out what their needs are, what is really going on, listen to their cultural knowledge, value their cultural knowledge. It is through their lens that I think that we learn how to theorize, to think, to understand. And I think that we really need that space for us to really address, some of the issues that we're dealing with. But I think community activists, community members need our support for a campaign to change some of the things that we are encountering in these areas.
Thank you.
So I got a chat from Rich Norman, and then after Rich, we're going to call on Ms. Natasha.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Lofton, for a wonderful presentation. I'm a retired Chicago public school principal at Nicholas-Son High School, and I live in Edgewater, which is I live about a half mile south of Loyola University. And I'm a lifelong Chicagoan. I was educated in public schools here, graduated from Loyola. And I was struck by one of the comments you made regarding the lack of diversity in academic teaching. My experience in starting school in the 50s and 60s and getting graduate degrees in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and postgraduate work beyond that, I had, I think, two African-American professors over 60 years, over, 40 some graduate courses. So that point really struck home to me, and I think it really affects the perspective that many of us gain in education, or lack of perspective for that matter, because of that dearth of representation. And as a retired principal at Son, one of the things I did when I was there from 2005 to 2010 is I worked with my political leadership in the state legislature and in U.S. Congress to get funding for specific things that we need, like computer labs, as you mentioned previously in your presentation. And we actually had a couple of science labs that were gutted and rebuilt and made into science labs that would be the norm in any suburban district. And I was just wondering if you would think that when we talk about reparations, that debt that we owe, that could be part of that rebuilding of the community to provide not the same resources, but the resources needed, which is actually an excess in resources to combat the limitations that people have from poor economic circumstance. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. I think academia, we need to do a better job with diversity. I'm at Hopkins right now, and one of the things I discovered this week was that very few, I think it was not until the late 70s, early 80s, that they actually started hiring African Americans, right? In a city that is 80% African American. Right now it's around 68%, but in the late 80s it was really high. So there's a lot of work to be done. I'm in the School of Education, but to be honest with you, I am one of the only African American males in the School of Education that's on a research track, right? So there's still a lot of work to be done. I was at Columbia, and it's the same thing right there. And so there's work to be done, and we must aggressively do the work, right? The work is hard. The work is hard. And I think one of the things that I'm grappling with the concentrated debt is, and I want to share this with everyone because maybe we could get feedback from some people on this, that the debt is in so many ways on multiple levels, right? There's a debt of humanity, right? That debt of humanity, right, has caused all of these issues that African Americans are experiencing in the United States, right? It was a reason, this taking away and making it seem like African Americans were not human with slavery, right? And still never addressing that, right? But not just addressing that, but the segregation of, like, and the confinement and the criminal justice system, all these things really dehumanize African Americans. So we're dealing with that debt of humanity, right? That we must really think about, and even goes to the students, because in order to be a student, you have to be human, right? Student, human, right? But if you're still viewed as something else, there's that debt continues. So the debt on that level, right? That's something that we need to think about. But then also the debt, the tangible debt, right? So when we think about, the funding in schools, when we think about the policies over hundreds of years preventing African Americans from living in certain places, we must also address that debt as well. But also the debt within the community as well. When we think about, when I mentioned earlier that hyper police brutality, right? The abundance of liquor stores in certain areas. When we think about, the increase of crime and also violence, that's also connected to a debt, right? And then you also think about, just so many things that we can think about that really can relate to that debt. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking through my head. It's the humanization that, in order to allow policy and practices to actually work, for African Americans, that same debt that Martin Luther King talked about, that check of insufficient funds in order to get equality and justice, right? Like everyone else is getting equality. Well, not everyone else, but whites are getting in the United States. So I'm still working with that, and I would love to have that conversation and gain insight from everyone, even here, regarding how many layers is related to this concentrated debt that we are experiencing, and what are some of the best ways to go about actually gaining what is owed to African Americans. So thank you for your question.
So I'm going to go with Ms. Natasha next, and then Christine, I saw you had your hand up. So Ms. Natasha, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you all for hosting this space. Professor, this was it was just on point. So I'm a native of South Chicago. I was recruited through JROTC, enlisted in the Air Force with a plan for 4 years. Somehow that turned into 20.
I know.
And so these spaces have been just on point for me. I've been at most of the Friday seminars, but this one, I was over here snapping my fingers, yes, that's it. Because the things that you shared about the students in Baltimore, we see that in Chicago. We see it through the most recent uprising for police-free schools, CPD out of CPS. And as a strong adult ally in that movement, I'm thinking about, in the information that you presented, what does it look like to be in strong solidarity or an accomplice to this work? So I consider myself a parent organizer, and I'm often struggling with where is there's a 360 approach, this is an elephant, how do we eat it together? And so when I hear you presenting this information in this space, and I'm thinking about following your work, I follow Dave Stovall. I've had him come out to our high school and host, talks and help us understand engineer conflict and how education plays a role in that. And what I'm oftentimes feeling is like, okay, how do we approach this together in our stakeholder groups, right? So these swim lanes that we typically stand in or swim in, and we usually don't pull those dividers up and row this thing in the same direction to really put some meat on the bone. And I feel like this is the moment, and I don't want to miss this window of opportunity. So I'm curious to hear one or two points that you can give me as a parent to help organize parents to pay attention. How do we get involved? What are the questions? What are we looking for? And how do we continue to connect ourselves to scholars like yourself to really like bridge that gap and like, let's do this thing together. Thanks.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for your question. I really appreciate that. And once again, I think these are hard questions, right? But I think these are the questions that we really need to start thinking about is how do we produce this movement to bring the change that we need? And I think that we do need a movement. I do think that we do need to get out of our silos, right? I'm the professor expert on this, and you're the community activist on this, and you're the parent on this. So, you're the parent. I think that we need to release ourselves from the roles that we've been taught to developing the relationships, because relationships with this, I believe, will be the superpower, right? And so we can honestly get on the same page and acknowledge what is going on and work together in harmony. I believe that we really can bring about the change that we need. It was so great to see so many African American women this election talk about AKAs and women talking about voting for Harris, right? Coming out in Georgia and working together and doing things together. I think that one of the things that we want to do is figure out how do we do this together, and I think we can. I think that we have to start thinking about new ways of connecting and ways of meaningfully connecting with each other. And I think this is possible too. And so I am still trying to understand the best way to do it, because there's so many people who will put stumbling blocks in our way because anti-Blackness is real. Right. But as long as we understand that that's real and that we're on the same page, I think that we can overcome all of this, as well as acknowledging that there are many people who are not African American who really want to support these works and these actions as well and acknowledge the hate that African Americans are encountering. Right. And so I love your question because I think this is the point. This is the time where we saw a Black man who was killed, in 8 minutes, George Floyd, this is the time for us really to get together and to work together so these things will not happen again. So thank you for your question.
And Christine, did you want to go ahead?
Might be good to hear me. So I'm Christine George, and I'm actually on staff as a faculty at Curl. So thank you. This was a wonderful presentation and just raised all these questions for me. And this is a little off, but one of the things that I believe and is that basically the education system is one of it reproduces our culture.
Yeah.
And then so I was really struck by the comment about that it's in the air, which to me is in the culture, and thinking a lot about how, and this goes for all of society, is how do we get the educational system not to reproduce racism and not to reproduce this inequality, on one hand, the struggles within the Black community and the struggles to deal with the debt, and the day-to-day reality that people are facing, but how do we produce teachers? How do we produce citizens that aren't creating this racist and this divisive culture? So, and so that's a lot bigger. You know, and some of it is, you know, what Rich said about the fact that he only had 2 African-American professors. And some of it is that really the importance of education and in enriching individuals and then educators having a much more important status within society is not there. I mean, I know this is like, but I'm just, you know, thinking of that and how that the education system can become an instrument for changing that air, not only in terms of changing the oppression within African-American communities, but larger, you know, talking about the commonality and solidarity and really just changing the culture of our society, because that's what holds us together in a lot of ways. I mean, as you know, that is our potential place of unity. So anyway, that's what I've been thinking about.
Yeah. No, you're right. You know, I think we need more African American faculty members. I think we need more African American teachers, right? Since the accountability movement and neoliberal reforms, you know, since the 80s, we've seen less and less African American teachers in urban schools. And so that's a major problem that we want to address. But once again, we must connect this to policy, right? I think if we really want change, we really have to produce the policies and be on people to produce the policies to bring about that change. To have those more African Americans, we can produce policies to ensure that we have more African American teachers. But not only that, we can produce environments in schools where students are actually valued. Their knowledge is important. Their parents are not, not looked upon in negative ways. We can do that, But I think once again, we have to work together. This is a human issue. Poverty is a person-made problem that we have throughout the United States. For African Americans, it relates to the anti-Blackness that they experience throughout the years that have causing these issues and the lack of opportunities because of the anti-Blackness, right? And so we must produce the policies, to go back earlier, to protect African Americans as well as other people, right? To ensure that the environments we are nurturing, to ensure that the environments that we are loving, to ensure that the environments that we are healthy and bring about overall well-being. So yes, once again, this is a time where, as we dealing with this COVID and many of us are homes, that we, I think, could be thinking about how we can make things better. More than anything, we realize some of the things that we thought we needed, before COVID, we know that we do not need. So I think some of the systems that we have in place right now, we must continue to have these conversations and these dialogues to understand, what do we need, right? But also, how do we empower people? What does justice really look like for everyone, And so, I think these are the questions, and also be okay with not being right, but really grappling and understanding, and us coming together, hearing different voices, hearing different understanding, and come together in harmony so that we can bring that change.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. I really, agree with you, but one thing I just want to say is it can't be, African Americans are 14% of the population. It can't be on their backs. I mean, it has to, on one hand, it's much broader than that. And it's how we create a democratic education, you know, so that, I mean, I really echo what you were saying at the end about there has to be that everybody feels that sense of justice.
Yeah.
And that, you know, and because of the segregation aspects of our society, that you know, that we, you know, there are states. I mean, again, it isn't just African American, it's Native American, it's poor people, it's Latinos, it's different in different places. And when you add them all together, it's really, you know, the vast majority. But it's just trying to figure out how you really reform and change the whole educational system. That's the purpose of education. To see that commonality. And I think that the struggles that you've been talking about form the beginning of that process, but trying to figure out how that merges into some place like Wyoming. I mean, I think is really just important.
Yeah. And I don't want you to misunderstand me. Never would I want the pain and suffering of African Americans to be on their backs, or that it is only their burden for African Americans. The problem is that we continue to say justice and equality, but we often exclude African Americans.
Absolutely.
People and their, you know, and their experiences. So it's not that I'm saying that but no, I think that often, you know, we somehow we forget when we do get to a place of saying equality and justice. When you look at the table, it's all white, you know, even in the midst of that. So that's something that we really need to think about, you know, and that's why I was saying it's the multiple voices that we need to hear in order to address this problem, but make it a movement where we are able to unpack our own privilege and allow other voices and experiences to also lead in this as well.
And then we've got about 5 minutes left. Carol, I saw that you put something in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and ask that question?
Not really a question. Well, I guess it is. In 2006, then Senator Obama gave the graduation address at Northwestern, and he talked about the fact that America suffers from a deficit of empathy. There are people who just don't care. And we see these examples. We know there's prejudice. We see it happening all day long, and there are people who just don't care. And I think that, to me, is the biggest obstacle. How do we get people to care?
Oof. That's hard. I don't know. Yeah, particularly when you think about our society and how people can exploit people and take advantage of people and feel okay about all of it, you know? So I'm not sure how to answer that question. I at one point would say that you just got to show them, you know, but I am done showing people who don't want to look after you show them so many times, right? So I'm not sure when it comes to the empathy question, when people choose not to be empathetic. I'm not sure.
Dr. Lofton, I'm sorry, Carol, go ahead, please.
I think part of it is that many people don't have exposure to difference, and they aren't willing to admit their own privilege. And if we can raise awareness of that, and you touched on that a little bit earlier, you know, we have to understand our own privilege and our own perspective and see what that does to others. And, you know, that's a huge challenge that goes so far beyond money, resources, and everything. That goes to, you know, perceptions. And you're right, very challenging and frightening.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say that when I retired, I hadn't been able to do this while I had the obligations of the university. But when I retired, I was very concerned about Black seniors in the seniors buildings all over Chicago and the way they're treated. And so I joined the Jane Addams Senior Caucus.
Yes.
And in these past, since 2017, we have passed 2 ordinances that protect seniors in their buildings. There are people who don't care about seniors, no matter whether they're white or Hispanic or Black, they're busy or something else. But boy, that ordinance is in place. And those laws now that are effective to protect those seniors are in place. And I know when I was a professor, I just couldn't get involved with that. I had too much on my plate. But but I'm telling you, if there are organizations out there that can do things to really move this city to stand up for the rights of every person, which includes, of course, our African Americans, Hispanics, and everybody else. Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful.
Kelly?
And I just, I appreciate the sense of overwhelm and also recognize this sense of pessimism that folks are talking about. I also put in the chat that starting with people who do care,
Yes.
building institutions and networks in which anti-Blackness is not acceptable, in which Black lives are celebrated and thrive, is at least a start. I'm not a fan of going and trying to persuade people about to change what's in their brains. I don't really know how to do that, but I do know that we're also at a historical moment when you say no one cares. What I see is many young people. I saw this in voting. I see this in my classroom. I see this in young people of many different stripes who actually do care and are looking hard for what they can do to make a difference.
Yeah.
And I just want to go back to when in September 11th, I was in New York City. Sister Helen Prejean, the death penalty activist, was to give a talk on the 12th. We all thought that the buildings came down, she's not giving a talk. Well, actually, she said, no, I'm definitely giving a talk. Like, what better time to give a talk than now? I didn't think any students showed up. 300 students showed up. And they all asked the same question, what can I do? And she said the same thing. She said, you need to find a place on that rope and you need to grab on with all the people you can get hold of and you need to pull hard. Mm-hmm. Don't wear yourself out in one fell swoop. She said, because this is your lifetime. This is what you're going to do over the lifetime. So no one would ever call me Miss Pollyanna, Miss Optimist, but I do know that I'm seeing at a moment, even at Loyola, which I never thought would change, hard work by people who are making a difference and people confronting their endemic, inherent anti-Blackness in ways that are not comfortable, myself included, and things are making a difference. It's not going to change overnight. It is a lifetime, but I can't help but say that there is hope, there are possibilities, and action is happening. Yes. So I don't want to say like everything's great. It's horrific, but that doesn't mean it's hopeless.
Absolutely. And it's so important to acknowledge that let's get to that promised land. Let's get there, and we can get there, and that's so important for us to understand. We can get there.
Well, thank you, Richard. It looks like we are about at time. I know there might have been a couple more questions. Richard, do you have a couple more minutes?
Yes.
Okay, so if anybody wants to stay on, you're more than welcome if you have another question. But otherwise, thank you so much for everyone being here. And again, Richard, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for this.
Thank you.